This video is going to be the first of many videos that I'll be putting together in a series called Flysky Nirvana for Dummies, where I'll cover off the basics of the transmitter or the controller or the radio, whatever you want to call it. There's an absence of support, documentation and the likes, or a manual that's half decent for the Nirvana. Most people who've come across to the Nirvana have come from a Flysky background, which, if you're like me, started off with something like this, the i6, with a pretty basic interface. Turnigy Pro Evolution, again, straightforward interface. Flysky's never really had much of an OpenTX presence, and if you're coming from another radio with OpenTX, you're probably not familiar with the interface, or there hasn't been an interface like it. It's a little bit different, it's a bit bespoke. I'll cover off things like basic menu navigation, what the key functions of the menu do. I'll cover off a video on how to bind and set up a new quad on the Flysky Nirvana and all that sort of stuff there, and then based on feedback and what people are saying, they'd want to see more on, happy to go down that path as well and cover off some of those things. First thing I'll say is make sure that you update to the latest firmware. I'll put a link in the description and maybe on the actual video itself to another video I've got on how to update to the latest firmware. If you have reservations and you're coming from an OpenTX underground FPV version, it's dead. Underground FPV are dead. Even if that version works for you today and you're happy with it, the reality is there are going to be lots of updates. There already have been updates that have brought along functionality such as trainer support, multi-protocol support, better functioning widgets, less bugs, AFHDS3 is coming out, and the likes, and that's just going to continue. So we know that Flysky are going to continue to update OpenTX. Bite the bullet, get onto the latest version, because there might be some differences in what I'm going to show you. Also worth noting, I fly quads. I don't know anything about fixed wing and planes and that sort of stuff, so there may be functions within the Nirvana menu system that I will skip over or not cover off just because I'm focusing on quads. But there'll be some value in there as well. I'm not going to cover every single thing on the menu and those sorts of things there. I'm just going to give a basic overview of the key functions that you should be using and what some of the stuff in that menu does. Let me check my notes, see if I've forgotten anything here. No, I reckon that's pretty much it. So let's now jump across to the transmitter and have a look at the menu and cover off the basic menu navigation. Okay, first things first, before I jump into the menu, just some of the basics of the actual controller, more on the hardware side I suppose, or the general product overview. I've removed the bracket for the neck strap, and that comes with a couple of screws like that, little hex screws, or little, I suppose hex screws. That's pretty straightforward. You remove those there, just the two screws. That gives you access to your DFU button there, which is your bind button, let's say, or your boot button to update your firmware. It also gives you access to your SD card, which you can just push and it'll pop out. You can access the content of your SD card through the through a USB connection to your PC, but I recommend replacing the SD card with a better one, something that's a little bit faster. They've put in a pretty cheap one, and it has been known to cause issues. You don't really need more than 16 meg, 32 meg if you've got one lying around, but you just want something a little bit better quality, better transfer rate there, and that will navigate through the menu a bit quicker for you and cause less issues if you do get issues. The thumbsticks here, or the sticks I should say, throttle sticks and so forth, these are M3, or the size of these are M3, so if you do want to replace those, you just unscrew them like that. There's two parts there, you can unscrew both parts and you can put whatever combination suits you. Here are some different things that would work with it. So if you do like the gamer console thumb style flat ones, you can get those as well. M3. Antenna position, you want it straight up. The signal's actually coming out this way, and I'll lower that there. Signal comes out this way more so than that way, and it's good practice to have, if you have a diversity receiver, i.e. a receiver with two antennas, you want them kind of at 90 degrees. So if you have them that way or that way, the antenna placement on your receiver should be at about 90 degrees, and that's your optimal settings there as well. On the back, the unit comes with this module bay plug thing, setup thing, bracket. There is a proper name for it, but anyway, the moral of the story is you don't need to use it if you don't want to use a module. You might want to use a module if you want multi-protocol support or crossfire or something like that. Otherwise, it's just optional. The switches that you have here, You assign which switches you want to use based on the receiver and flight controller that you use in the combination, and however many channels are available to you. You'll find that with the Nirvana in general and the receivers on the market and flight controls these days, you'll have more than enough available to you. So it comes down to, you know, pick the switches that you like. I like that as my armed. I like that as my mode if I want to switch between acro and angle. And then you can use other functions for the actual software menu itself. Obviously you've got your switches down the back there, and again you can use some of these for, say, turtle mode or beeper or anything like that. But you can assign which switches you want to use. You won't really need to use them all. These guys here are not really that relevant for quads. Sorry, these guys I should say here are not really that relevant for quads. Where you can use those is more around, you know, volume of the actual menu itself. The batteries are 18650s. Samsung is a good brand to get. The unit can charge while the battery's inside. You can hot swap, meaning you can remove a battery and still run it off the second battery and put in, replace your battery here. I would recommend probably getting an external charger or a separate charger, but it can charge there. That's probably the main stuff that you need to know about. A couple of other points. If you're coming off an older, like the i6 receiver or something like that, what you'll note is that this does not have AF-HDS 1 support, the original. It's from 2 onwards, or it's from 2 alone I should say, or 2A. What that means is that if you have an old quad, which is rare these days, that's running off AF-HD, the original protocol, it's not going to work on the Nirvana unless you use, say, a multi-protocol module or a module purpose-built that covers off Flysky's AF-HDS. I think that's it. I think that's all the main stuff. Okay, let's jump into the menu. As I mentioned, I'm not going to cover off every single detail in the menu. I'm going to focus on the key areas that are used most frequently and the ones that you would need to set up and get started and use with, I guess, practicality, let's say. So we've got really 4 main buttons here. We've got our OpenTX button, which is kind of like the Windows button on a PC in some respects, and it's that high level stuff that you don't use that often. Then you've got your model button here. I'm not sure if these are the official names, but that's what I'm calling it. And that allows you to set up your model, customize your model, do things relevant to the specific model that you've selected. So if I were to set up a particular function within that menu system, that function is only applicable to the model I have selected, as opposed to the next button, which is the radio button. And I will go into this and show you quickly all the way to the right here. This I button is where you find the firmware version that you're on. You kind of think you'd find that in the OpenTX submenu somewhere, but you actually find it there. So anything I define there is relevant to the whole radio. So if I set up a global function or a function within there, then that's applicable to every model that I select. So quick example is I've got my ARM switch all configured under the radio, and that way no matter which model I select, that's always going to be armed. I might have models that I want to fly in horizon zone, and that's not that common. In that case, then I assign the relevant switches and sound files and so forth just to the model as opposed to the global radio settings in there. And the third button relates to your widgets and what your interface looks like. So let's look a little bit deeper in OpenTX, and in fact before I do, a couple of obvious ones. Here you've got obviously your battery, you've got your volume, you've got your telemetry, and then you've got your time and date. You've also got your trims here as well, and your trims can be set again specific to a model. So if you save your trims, that's only relevant to that model. So
trim center.
There you go. You control your trims from there. I have volume. You can see over here the volume display, and as well as the slider there. I've got volume connected to the slider so I can control that, and you can see that reflected in the interface. OpenTX is probably only 2 that you use that often, maybe 3, but realistically model select's the main one that you use. This is where you create your models. A tip, I like to create a template, so if you are using let's say Crossfire or different modules that you've plugged in, I create a blank template for each of those. So rather than create a new quad every time I add a quad, I simply duplicate an existing one. Now I can select models from here, I can create new models from scratch, and I can duplicate, which is my preference, from within here, or I can delete a model. Worth noting, there's no simple way of reordering the models. I've made another video on how to hack that, and you need to plug it into a computer and mess around with some files. Not that hard, but just a bit annoying. But there is no way of reordering models or tidying that up better than what you would like. Quick look at monitors. This is where you can check to see everything's correct and check to see how they're performing to a degree. So here, that's my throttle, my yaw, so everything seems alright. Roll, pitch. Other things here I'm not going to cover off. Reset can be handy. This is where if you've got some timers and things like that, we can reset those. But the recommendation there is that you just assign a switch, and I cover that off in another video there. So in this case here,
Timer reset.
I've got my reset assigned through there, and that way if I've got a timer visible on screen, I can just reset it that way rather than go through this menu here. So kind of not really worth looking at. That's the main stuff. Yeah, I think they're the main things. You don't need to worry too much. About is kind of useless because you get your firmware info from the radio button anyway. Let's look at the model, and this is probably the most important part. So this is where we set up the model, and I will in this series create a specific video just on how to add models and how to configure those and so forth. So this stage here, just a quick run through. Model name, this is where you name it. This is where you go through your model image, so what you want to display. If you set up your widgets, you select the image there. You can assign your timers through here. So in this case here, I've got mine assigned to switch A down, which is my armed switch. And that starts the timer, so I can see how long I've been in the air.
Disarmed.
Multiple timers can be set up. Going down, really, whether or not we want to see the trims, the trim setup displayed. Pre-flight checks, this is where if you want the radio to warn you that you've got arm switched on, for example, you can configure that within here. Whether or not you want to beep or something there. Global functions, anything you define on the radio global functions, which is, let's say, for example, arm switch. I'll keep using basic examples. The arm switch I have defined in global functions, and I want to use all available global functions for this particular model. Internal RF, if you're running Flysky, you want internal RF. The default is Flysky PWM-I and channel 1 to 14. RX frequency by default is 50, and then you want to set up your failsafe as well. So a quick look at this where you've got PWM-I and S, PPM-I and S. PWM is basically how your receiver communicates with your flight controller. PWM is better than PPM, that's what you want to know, and it's really around how many messages or how much they can talk at once is the simplest way of looking at it. I is iBus, S is S-Bus. By default, just about every Flysky setup is iBus. You will have some setups that you can configure to S-Bus. For example, I recently bought the Emax Hawk Pro. I put the stock receiver, I can't remember the name of it, that came with the Nirvana into that, and needed to have that set up as S because that configuration required it. But generally speaking, when you buy Flysky gear, it's set to I, and you want to go down to PWM. External module or external RF, this is if you have an external module plugged in and whether or not you want trainer mode. So they're your key setup items in your model. I'm not going to cover heli because that's helicopters and stuff. I don't do that. Flight modes, again, I'll probably leave that to when I set up an actual quad. So for now, I'll leave that as is. Likewise with inputs, mixer again. Outputs, this is pretty handy because, and again I'll cover this off in greater detail when we look at the setup of a module, but we can have a look at an output. Where this is useful is if you've got your flight controller plugged into, or your quad plugged into Betaflight. Let's say your quad's not arming. One of the reasons is when you're in Betaflight, you might see the 1 to 2,000 range. If that's out, you can adjust it from within here. So you can put, if it's lower, if it's say 990 instead of 1000, then you can go to your minimum and bump that up, and likewise your maximum, you can lower that down if you're above the 2000 or if you're not close enough to it. So that's where this becomes a bit relevant. Curves I'm not going to talk about. Again, global variables, logical switches. Logical switches, just in terms of what that is, a good example of one is that you can kind of define a logical switch, and a common practice for this is, let's say you want the Nirvana to alert you that your battery on your quad is low, or your RSSI is generally set up by default, but let's say you want an alarm to tell you that the battery is low. You can mess around with logical switches to define a formula basically that says if below 3.3 volts, then give warning, is what that's about. Special functions is relevant. Again, this is the horizon mode example I gave before. So this is where I can actually define a function specific to this model as opposed to specific to all models. So an example of that is armed. It makes sense that you want armed to be on the same switch for every single model. But let's say for whatever reason you want a different arm switch for a different model, which is illogical, then you can set up that function from within here. Or if you want this particular model to play a particular sound,
Shit is about to get real.
And that button plays a different sound for different models, that's the sort of stuff that you can do with special functions here. Again, Lua scripts, again, we're starting to get into the advanced zone there, so I'm going to leave that there. And telemetry. Telemetry is pretty useful in that this is where, let's say you want to set up a widget and see which channel or which setup. Oh, I've got that armed. Switch that off. Reset that. Let's say you want to know where or what the label is for RSSI off the quad, so that on your screen you can display what the telemetry signal is. You can check here to see if you've got your quad plugged in, do a read here, and it will reflect which sensors are giving out which data, and you can use that data down the track. So that's probably the main stuff you need to worry about there. There is some more information and more settings that I will say for when I do a video of setting up a model that talks about how to assign switches and channels and so forth, and how to label those accordingly so they're universally used. But I'll leave it at that for now. Let's look at the actual radio setup. So from within the radio setup, you've got your general stuff here. So touch to enlarge is a good one. This tells you, when you're typing in the keyboard, if you are struggling to type things, you want to have that set to touch to enlarge. That makes it, the text and everything bigger. With your sound, you can adjust your different sound settings there, your beep length, background volume and so forth. You can change the pitch of your beep, so you can customize some basic stuff there as well. Your haptic, that's the vibration, how long and hard you want it to feel. That sounds wrong, but anyway. Your alarms, if the battery on the transmitter is low, where do you want to set that? How long do you want the backlight to be on for? So some really basic stuff. If you've got GPS setups, I don't, then you can do some stuff in there as well. And they're all the main items. This is basically a list of kind of like the directory on your SD card. Not that much of a function within here, so you can see we can see which images I've got locally here, but you don't really perform much functions. It's more of a read-only area, I suppose. Global functions. This is great. I covered this off already in the custom OpenTX custom mods or something like that, I've called it, video, and this is really how to set up a lot of the switches and the functions that you want to use across all models. So just like special functions which are only relevant to the model, global functions are relevant to everything. So examples of which, I've got my volume, my volume is defined in here. This is where I can adjust my volume. I've got my timer resets, my armed switch, my different
Angle mode, acro mode.
You can see that in working there.
I meant to do that. I meant to do that.
So just random things, sounds.
Shit is about to get real. Timer reset.
They're quick examples of what I would use, and then I've got beepers and turtle mode and everything defined in here as well. So that's pretty handy. This is really where you want to customize a lot of the stuff in there as well. Trainer mode, I won't touch. Hardware, I'll probably leave that alone as well. calibration, so you can see the sticks there. Mine are fine. If you want to calibrate the sticks, if you have any issues with where they're aligning, if they're out, you can check in that mixer screen at the very start under the OpenTX menu. That will tell you if you're out as well. And the I button, which I think I covered off, really tells you where you've got your Flysky version there. And if you have got issues, your factory reset button's in there as well, but I wouldn't go using that too often. Some people like to do a proper factory reset, which is a bit of a pain when they update to a newer firmware. If you've got issues, then that's one of the troubleshooting options that I would recommend. Otherwise, don't bother with it. Last thing I'll cover off is your menu configuration or user interface settings. So here you can change the color settings. So you can see here the white and the light blue. There's a light blue, so you can change those by just playing around with those numbers there and changing what the color scheme looks like. Another tip, if you've recently upgraded your firmware and you've found that your text is missing just nowhere, then it's simply a matter of adjusting this and making your background color white or changing the color within here. Top bar, this allows you to define these two widgets here. So as a quick example, in this case here, I'm going to make this the image that I have associated with the model appear there. So whenever I switch to this one, I've got that there. And I can add something like a battery, what's the battery voltage reading on the actual transmitter is what I like to do as a second one there. So the top menu simply allows you to add a couple of things in there. Let's go back. Then we've got, or the top bar I should say, then we've got here, this here is, you can add multiple screens. So what does that mean? If I set up a widget here, and I'm going to use that same image there. So there I've got it there. Let's say I want a second screen. I'll go there, I'll add that main view. And by the way, these are pretty straightforward, but you can have it such that the top bar is or isn't visible, that your flight mode, your sliders and your trims are also visible as well. You can remove this screen completely. So just to show you what it means by multiple screens, if I set up these widgets and go in here, let's say outputs is probably a good one, and we'll do that. So now I've got an output screen. So going back, all the way back to there, I can actually flick between screens there. So you can actually have a few different things set up there, or you can, on the second screen, set up widgets. In fact, I'll go back there, or you can actually tap that and add different screens there, and that allows me to do, say, outputs for one, and on this one here, just to give a quick example, the image there. So when I go back, here are my different screens there. That's a really basic overview of the functions within the Nirvana. Probably the next video I'll do will be covering off how to set up a model, and just some basic model setup tips there as well. If you've got feedback, if there's stuff in there that you want to see that you don't think is covered off, let me know. I do want to stick to the basics to begin with, because I don't think there's enough support out there. The manual that comes with this thing, or the online manual, which I will post in the description, is pretty high level, so it's pretty useless. That's it.